Dr. Megan again, and welcome to another edition of Lunchtime Storytime. Today, as you will see, I am wearing new fun hair. I got this wig on eBay as well, and today seemed like a good day to wear it because today is Thursday, and that means that this is my last reading for the week, as tomorrow, Friday, May 15th, I will be offline. But I will return next week with more stories, so don't worry. And I will probably return at some point with more fun hair because I'm really digging it. This one's purple, so I thought it would be a good day to wear purple hair, as our book today is one of my favorites, Blueberries for Sal by Robert McCloskey. This book was initially published in 1948 and won the Caldecott Honor Medal, and I think you will agree that it's a very charming little story. So, let's get into the show. Blueberries for Sal by Robert McCloskey. One day, little Sal went with her mother to Blueberry Hill to pick blueberries. Little Sal brought along her small tin pail, and her mother brought her large tin pail to put blueberries in. "We will take our berries home and can them," said her mother. "Then we will have food for the winter." Little Sal picked 3 berries and dropped them in her little tin pail. Kaplink, kaplink, kaplunk. She picked 3 more berries and ate them. Then she picked more berries and dropped 1 in the pail. Kaplink! And the rest she ate. Then little Sal ate all 4 blueberries out of her pail. Her mother walked slowly through the bushes, picking blueberries as she went and putting them in her pail. Little Sal struggled along behind, picking blueberries and eating every single one. Little Sal hurried ahead and dropped a blueberry in her mother's pail. It didn't sound "kaplink" because the bottom of the pail was already covered with berries. She reached down inside to get her berry back. Though she really didn't mean to, she pulled out a large handful because there were so many blueberries right up close to the one she had put in. Her mother stopped picking and said, "Now, Sal, you run along and pick your own berries. Mother wants to take her berries home and can them for next winter." Her mother went back to her picking, but little Sal, because her feet were tired of standing and walking, sat down in the middle of a large clump of bushes and ate blueberries. On the other side of Blueberry Hill, Little Bear came with his mother to eat blueberries. "Little Bear," she said, "eat lots of berries and grow big and fat. We must store up food for the long, cold winter." Little Bear followed behind his mother as she walked slowly through the bushes, eating berries. Little Bear stopped now and then to eat berries. Then he had to hustle along to catch up. Because his feet were tired of hustling, he picked out a large clump of bushes and sat down right in the middle and ate blueberries. Over on the other side of the hill, little Sal ate all of the berries she could reach from where she was sitting. Then she started out to find her mother. She heard a noise from around a rock and thought, "That is my mother walking along." But it was a mother crow and her children, and they stopped eating berries and flew away, saying, "Caw, caw, caw." Then she heard another noise in the bushes and thought, "That is surely my mother, and I will go to that way." But it was Little Bear's mother instead. She was tramping along, eating berries and thinking about storing up food for the winter. Little Sal tramped right along behind. By this time, Little Bear had eaten all the berries he could reach without moving from his clump of bushes. Then he hustled off to catch up with his mother. He hunted and hunted, but his mother was nowhere to be seen. He heard a noise from over a stump and thought, "That is my mother walking along." But it was a mother partridge and her children. They stopped eating berries and hurried away. Then he heard a noise in the bushes and thought, "That is surely my mother. I will hustle that way." But it was little Sal's mother instead. She was walking along, picking berries and thinking about canning them for next winter. Little Bear hustled right along behind. Little Bear and Little Sal's mother, and Little Sal and Little Bear's mother were all mixed up with each other among the blueberries on Blueberry Hill. Little Bear's mother heard Sal walking along behind and thought it was Little Bear, and she said, "Little Bear, munch, munch, eat all you can possibly hold." Little Sal said nothing. She picked 3 berries and dropped them, kaplink, kaplank, kaplunk, in her small tin pail. Little Bear's mother turned around to see what on earth could make a noise like kaplink. "Whoa!" she cried, choking on a mouthful of berries. "This is not my child. Where is Little Bear?" She took one good look and backed away. She was old enough to be shy of people, even a very small person like Little Sal. Then she turned around and walked off very fast to hunt for Little Bear. Little Sal's mother heard Little Bear tramping along behind and thought it was Little Sal. She kept right on picking and thinking about canning blueberries for next winter. Little Bear padded up and peeked into her pail. Of course, he only wanted to taste a few of what was inside, but there were so many and they were so close together that he tasted a tremendous mouthful by mistake. "Now, Sal," said Little Sal's mother without turning around, "you run along and pick your own berries. Mother wants to can these for next winter." Little Bear tasted another tremendous mouthful and almost spilled the entire pail of blueberries. Little Sal's mother turned around and gasped, "My goodness! You are not Little Sal! Where is my child?" Little Bear just sat, munching and swallowing and licking his lips. Little Sal's mother slowly backed away. She was old enough to be shy of bears, even very small bears like Little Bear. Then she turned around and walked away quickly to look for Little Sal. She hadn't gone very far before she heard a kaplink, kaplink, kaplunk. She knew just what made that kind of noise. Little Bear's mother had not hunted very long before she heard a hustling sound that stopped now and then to munch and swallow. She knew just what made that kind of a noise. Little Bear and his mother went home down one side of Blueberry Hill, eating blueberries all the way and full of food stored up for next winter. And Little Sal and her mother went down the other side of Blueberry Hill, picking berries all the way, and drove home with food to can for next winter. A whole pail of blueberries, and 3 more besides. The end. And here we have Sal and her mother canning blueberries for next winter. So whenever I pick blueberries, I have a tendency to also eat as many as I put in my pail. So I love this book because it reminds me of going berry picking with my parents when I was a kid. So now we have, as usual, our story from the Paddington Treasury. And as always, if you have recommendations or think of books that you would like me to for you to read, leave a comment down below in the comments or send me a message and I will see what I can do about getting it. All right. So I believe that our chapter is The Last Dance. Mr. Brown hung his dressing gown on the bedroom door and then sat down on the bed, rubbing his eyes. 3 times I've been down to the front door, he grumbled, and all the time it was Paddington banging about in his room. I expect he's practicing his dancing, said Mrs. Brown sleepily. He said he was having trouble with his turns last night. Well, I'm having trouble with my sleep this morning, said Mr. Brown crossly. I've put my foot down. I can see you have, replied Mrs. Brown, eyeing her husband's slippers as he took them off. Right in the middle of Paddington's rosin. I think you'd better scrape it off. He'll be most upset if there's any missing. He bought it specially to stop his paws slipping on the linoleum. He had several nasty falls yesterday. Mr. Brown looked at his soles in disgust. Only a bear, he said bitterly, would want to do the tango at 6:30 on a Saturday morning. I only hope they don't have a bear's excuse me at the ball tonight. Anyone who lands Paddington as a partner is in for a pretty rough time. Perhaps he'll have improved by then, said Mrs. Brown hopefully. It can't be easy rehearsing with a pillow. Mrs. Brown turned over and closed her eyes, though more in an effort to blot out the mental picture of events to come than with any hope of going back to sleep. For although one half of her was looking forward to Mrs. Smith-Cholmondeley's annual Christmas ball that evening, the other half was beginning to have grave doubts about the matter, and recent events had only served to tip the scales further on the side of the doubts. But daylight lends enchantment to the gloomiest of views, and some at least of Mrs. Brown's worst fears were relieved when Paddington arrived downstairs a little later that morning, looking unusually spick and span, despite his disturbed night. I must say, you look very smart, she said, amid murmurs of approval from the others. There can't be many bears who sit down to breakfast in formal attire. There'll be one less, said Mrs. Bird, striking a warning note, if certain of them get any marmalade down their front. Mrs. Bird had suffered from bumps in the night as well, and with Christmas looming large on the horizon, she didn't want her kitchen turned into a bear's ballroom. Paddington considered the matter for a moment while he tackled his bacon and eggs. He was the sort of bear who believed in getting value for the money, and having heard how much Mr. Brown was paying to rent his suit, he wanted to make the most of it. All the same, if the Browns were having second thoughts on the subject of dancing, he had to admit that he was having third and even fourth ones himself. In the past, he had often watched dancing programs on the television and wondered why people made so much fuss, so it all looked terribly easy, just a matter of jumping about the floor in time to some music. But when he tried to do it, he soon found that even without a partner, his legs got tangled up, and he shuddered to think what it might be like when he had someone else's in the way as well. In the end, he had tried doing it on his bed for safety, but that had been worse still, rather like running round in circles on a cotton wool-covered trampoline. All in all, he decided dancing was much more difficult than it looked at first sight, and to everyone's relief, he announced that he was going out that morning in order to consult his friend Mr. Gruber on the subject. Over the years, Mr. Gruber had proved himself helpful on a variety of subjects, and Paddington felt sure he would be able to find something among the many books that lined the walls of his antique shop. Even so, he was still taken by surprise when he arrived at Mr. Gruber's and found his friend doing a kind of jig around his knickknacks table to the tune from an old wind-up gramophone. Mr. Gruber looked at Paddington sheepishly over the top of his glasses as he drew up a chair. I have a feeling you won't be the only one with problems tonight, Mr. Brown, he said, panting a little after his exertions. It's a long time since I last tripped the light fantastic. As Paddington had no idea Mr. Gruber could dance, let alone do a light fantastic, the news that he was also going to Mrs. Smith-Cholmondeley's ball came like a bolt from the blue, and he grew more and more excited when his friend drew his attention to a large poster in the window. Practically anyone who's anyone round here tonight is going, Mr. Brown, he said. They've got Alf Wiedersein's orchestra, and Norman and Hilda Church are bringing their formation dance team. Paddington looked most impressed as Mr. Gruber went on to explain that Norman Church was a very famous ballroom dancer indeed, and that apart from bringing his team, he would be judging the various competitions to be held during the course of the evening. And when Mr. Gruber, with a twinkle in his eye, reached up to one of the shelves and took down a book on dancing written by Mr. Church himself, Paddington could hardly believe his good fortune. He felt sure if he studied a book written by the man who was actually going to act as judge, he ought to do very well indeed. For the rest of that day, apart from the odd strength of the tango and an occasional thump from Paddington's room, guys, dogs, Joan, it's only the mailman. We get the mailman interruption pretty much every day, don't we? Joan! Shh. For the rest of that day, apart from odd strains of the tango, I think someone's come up on the couch. 1 minute. Wendy! Guys! Hush! Hush! Oh. Wendy! Wendy! Come here. Hey! She's not even there anymore. Come here. Wendy! I think we're just going to have to ignore them. All right, let's see. Oh, and now I'm out of focus. All right, let's see. All right, it's good enough. That's the fun thing about live readings, though, right? Is that anything can happen. Okay. Dogs. So much fun. For the rest of that day, apart from odd strains of the tango and an occasional thump from Paddington's room, number 32 Windsor Gardens remained remarkably quiet as everyone got ready for the big event. Paddington himself was waiting in the hall quite early in the evening, clutching Mr. Gruber's book in one paw and an alarm clock in the other, while he did some last-minute promenades by the front door. Wendy, enough! All right, so let's see if I can get this adjusted again to where you can see me. All right. It'll have to do. Although Norman Church's book was lavishly illustrated with footprints showing the various steps, none of them seemed to go anywhere, and as some were marked clockwise and others counterclockwise, he got very confused trying to work out which ones to follow and watch the hands of the clock on the same time. The book was called Learning to Hold Your Own on the Dance Floor in 25 Easy Lessons, and with only a matter of minutes to go, Paddington rather wished Mr. Church had made to do with 5 hard ones instead, for he found it difficult enough getting through the title, let alone reading the instructions. All the same, when they set off shortly afterwards, he soon joined in the general gaiety, and as they drew near the ballroom, he grew more and more excited. But the journey itself was nothing compared to the atmosphere once they were inside, and Paddington peered round with growing interest as he handed his duffel coat to an attendant. And here is Paddington in his fine evening dress. Strains of music floated out through a pair of double doors at the top of some stairs leading down to the dance floor. And beyond the stairs, he could see couples in evening dress gliding about, their faces lit by twinkling reflections from an enormous mirrored globe revolving high above them. Mr. Brown cocked an ear to the music as they joined Mr. Gruber and a small queue of other new arrivals. "They're playing Goodbye Blues," he said. "That's one of my favorites." "Goodbye Blues?" said Paddington, looking most upset. "But we've only just arrived." Mr. Gruber gave a tactful cough. "I think there'll be plenty more tunes before we leave, Mr. Brown," he said. Bending down, he drew Paddington to one side as the line moved forward. "I should put your best paw forward," he whispered. "I think you're about to be announced." Mr. Gruber pointed towards a man in an imposing wig and costume standing at the head of the stairs, and Paddington's eyes nearly popped out as he heard Mr. and Mrs. Brown's name ring out round the ballroom. "I don't think I've ever been announced before, Mr. Gruber," he replied, hastily stuffing as many of his belongings as possible underneath his jacket. "Oh, no!" Judy gave a startled gasp as she gave Paddington a quick last-minute check. "You've still got your bicycle clips on." Catching her daughter's words, Mrs. Brown looked anxiously over her shoulder. "Do take them off, dear," she warned. "You won't feel the benefit otherwise." Mindful of Mrs. Bird's remarks about keeping his formal suit clean, Paddington hadn't wanted to take any risks with the trouser bottoms, which tended to slip down rather, and with a forecast of snow in the air, he had decided to make doubly sure. All the same, he did as he was bidden, and as he approached the man doing the announcements, he bent down. "Excuse me," he called in a muffled voice. "I'm Mr. Brown, and I'm having trouble with my bicycle clips." "Mr. Cyclops Brown," called the man in sonorous tones. "Cyclops Brown!" exclaimed Paddington hotly. He stood up, clutching his clips, looking most upset that on the very first occasion of being as announced, his name should have been wrongly called. But by that time, the man was already halfway through announcing Mr. Gruber, and Paddington found himself face to face with Mrs. Smith Cholmondeley, who was waiting to greet her guests at the foot of the stairs. "I'm so sorry," said Mrs. Smith Cholmondeley, trying to pass the whole thing off with a merry laugh as she took Paddington's paw. "I always thought Cyclops had only one eye." She broke off as she followed Paddington's gaze toward the middle of the dance floor, for it was all too obvious that Paddington not only had two eyes, but that they were working extremely well. "That's Mr. Church," she explained, catching sight of a nattily dressed man posing beneath the spotlight. "He's about to lead off." As the music started up again, Mrs. Smith Cholmondeley turned back to Paddington. I see you've been doing some homework," she continued, catching sight of Mr. Gruber's book in his other paw. "If Mr. Church has trouble with his steps, he'll know where to come." Once again, Mrs. Smith Cholmondeley broke off, and a look of alarm came over her face. "I didn't say he has got trouble," she called. "I only said if. It was a joke. But Paddington was already halfway across the floor. "Don't worry, Mr. Church," he cried, waving his book. "I'm coming. I think it's all on page 45. Paddington reached the center of the floor in time to meet the first wave of advancing dancers. Norma and Hilda Church's formation dance team was just getting into its stride, and the smile on Mrs. Smith Cholmondeley's face had begun to look a trifle fixed. The one Mr. Church presented to his public looked as if it had been indelibly etched for some time. "Go away," he hissed as Paddington tapped him on the shoulder. "You're upsetting my Alberts." Norman Church looked as if he'd just thought up a few more choice items for his chapter on ballroom etiquette, but before he had time to put any of them into words, a very strange thing happened. As his team turned to make a sweeping movement back down the floor, a bell started to ring somewhere in their midst. There was a note of urgency about it which caused the leaders to falter in their stride. In a moment, all was confusion as those in the rear cannoned into the ones in front, and in less than the time than it takes to form up for a quadrille, the damage had been done. A group who thought a fire had broken out behind the bandstand jostled with another group who were equally convinced the floor was about to give way, and they, in turn, ran foul of those who simply wanted to see what was going on. In the middle of all the hubbub, Paddington suddenly reached inside his jacket. "It's all right, Mr. Church," he called, holding up a large round brass object. "It's only my alarm clock." In the silence that followed, Mr. Brown's voice sounded unusually loud. 2 minutes, he groaned. "That's all the time we've been here. 2 minutes. And look at it." There was no need to suggest looking at the scene on the dance floor, for the rest of the Browns were only too painfully aware of what it was like. Even Paddington, as he made his way back through the dancers, was forced to admit that he had rather wished the floor had collapsed, for it would have afforded a quick means of escape from the glances of those around him. "Never mind," said Judy, going forward to meet him. "We know you meant well." "Thank you very much," said Paddington gratefully, "but I don't think Mr. Church does." Casting an anxious glance over his shoulder, he allowed himself to be led off the floor in the direction of some tables to one side of the hall. "I think I'll sit this one out, thank you very much," he announced after consulting his book. Although the chapter on ballroom behavior didn't include any mention of what to do following the kind of disaster he had just experienced, there were quite a number of phrases Mr. Church recommended for use when you didn't want to dance, and Paddington felt like it was a good moment to test one or two of them. "Not that anyone's likely to ask him after what's just happened," said Mr. Brown as he whirled past the table a little later on. "It's a shame, really," agreed Mrs. Brown, catching sight of Paddington deep in his book. "He's been practicing so hard. I don't like to think of him being a wallflower, and he's been sitting there for ages." Mr. Brown gave a snort. "Anything less like a wallflower than Paddington would be difficult to imagine," he remarked. Mr. Brown was about to add pessimistically that the evening wasn't over yet, but at that moment there was a roll of drums, and all eyes turned in the direction of the bandstand as Norman Church climbed up and grasped the microphone in order to announce the start of the competitions. Now that the dance was in full swing, Mr. Church seemed to have recovered his good humor. "Now I want everyone, but everyone, to join in," he boomed. "There are lots of prizes to be won, lots of dances, and a special mammoth Christmas hamper for the best couple of the evening." Mrs. Church's words had a livening effect on the ball, and during the events which followed, he proved his worth as a master of ceremonies. He kept up such a steady flow of patter, even Paddington began to get quite worked up, and a marmalade sandwich that he'd brought along to pass the time lay untouched on the table beside him. It was while the fun was at its height that Mrs. Smith Cholmondeley suddenly caught sight of him peering through a gap in the crowd. "Come along," she called. "You heard what Mr. Church said. Everyone has to join in." Paddington gave a start. "Thank you very much, Mrs. Smith-Cholmondeley," he called excitedly. "I'd like to very much." "Oh!" Mrs. Smith-Cholmondeley's face dropped. "I didn't mean, that is, uh... She looked at Paddington uneasily and then glanced down at her program. "It is the Latin American section next," she said. "I believe you come from that part of the world." "Darkest Peru," agreed Paddington earnestly. Mrs. Smith-Cholmondeley gave a nervous laugh. "I'm not sure if Mr. Wiedersehen knows any Peruvian dances," she said, "especially dark ones, but we could try our hand at Roomba if you like." "Yes, please," said Paddington gratefully. "I don't think I've done one of those before." Paddington was very keen on anything new, and after slipping the bicycle clips over one of his sleeves for safety, he hastily thrust the marmalade sandwich behind his back, picked up his book, and rose from the table. "Ah, I see you're with it," said Mrs. Smith-Cholmondeley, mistaking the sudden flurry of movement for a dance step. Paddington clasped Mrs. Smith-Cholmondeley firmly with both paws. "I'm never without it," he replied. Peering round his partner's waist, he consulted the etiquette section of Mr. Church's book again. "Do you come here often?" he inquired politely. Mrs. Smith-Cholmondeley looked down at her feet, both of which were submerged between Paddington's paws. "No," she replied in a tone of voice which suggested that she was rather regretting her present visit. "Haven't you got any dancing shoes?" she asked. Paddington glanced at his bicycle clips. "I haven't even got a bike," he said, looking most surprised. Mrs. Smith-Cholmondeley gave him a strange look. "You really ought to have dancing pumps," she said, breathing heavily as she tried to lift her own and Paddington's feet in the time to the music. "It would make things so much easier." Paddington returned her look. He was beginning to get a bit fed up with the way the conversation was going. It wasn't at all like any of the examples in Mr. Church's book, most of which were to do with sitting out on balconies eating snacks. "I think Mr. Brown's got a spare wheel," he replied helpfully. "Have you got a puncture?" "No," said Mrs. Smith-Cholmondeley through her teeth. "I haven't. But if you stand on my feet much longer, I'm liable to have one." Paddington's claws were rather sharp, and they were digging deeper and deeper into her instep with every passing moment. "I'd be obliged if you would find somewhere else to put your paws." Paddington relaxed his grasp on Mrs. Smith-Cholmondeley and tried jumping up and down experimentally a few times. "I don't think I can," he gasped at last. "I have a feeling they're caught in your straps." To his surprise, when he looked up again, Mrs. Smith-Cholmondeley's face seemed to have gone a very funny color indeed. And not only that, but she had begun to wriggle in a way which certainly wasn't included in any of Mr. Church's illustrations for the Roomba. "My back!" she shrieked. "My back! There's an awful creature crawling down my back!" Almost turning herself inside out, Mrs. Smith-Cholmondeley reached behind herself and withdrew something long, golden, and glistening, which she gazed at with increasing horror. "It's all wet and sticky! Oh!" Paddington peered at the object dangling between his partner's forefinger and thumb with interest. "I don't think that's a creature, Mrs. Smith-Cholmondeley," he exclaimed. "It's a chunk. I must have dropped my marmalade sandwich down the back of your dress by mistake." Unaware of the drama that was taking place behind their hostess's back, Mr. Brown gave his wife a nudge. "Good Lord, Mary," he said. "Look at those two. They're going great guns." Mrs. Brown turned and glanced across the dance floor. "Well, I never!" she exclaimed with pleasure. "Who would have thought it?" But if Mr. and Mrs. Brown were astonished at the sight of the gyrations on the other side of the floor, the rest of the dancers were positively astounded. One by one, the other couples dropped out in order to take a closer look at Paddington and Mrs. Smith-Cholmondeley, seemingly moving as one, rocking and wiggling in time to the music. At a signal from Mr. Church, the man in charge of the spotlight concentrated his beam on the two figures, and as Alfreda Sane began urging his orchestra to greater and greater efforts, the shouts of encouragement, the clapping, and the stamping of feet began to shake the very rafters of the hall. Paddington himself became more and more confused as he clung to his partner, and far from needing an alarm clock to show him the way, he found himself wishing he'd brought a compass, for he hadn't the least idea where he'd started from, let alone where he was going. From the word go, the winners of the Mammoth Hamper for the best couple of the evening were never in doubt. Indeed, it would have taken a very brave man to have gone in the face of the cheers that rang out as the music came to an end at last. For some reason, as soon as willing hands had disentangled Paddington's paws from her shoe straps, Mrs. Smith-Cholmondeley beat a hasty retreat, and when she did appear at long last, it was in a different dress, but in the excitement, this went largely unnoticed. "Lovely little mover," said Norman Church enthusiastically, turning to Paddington as he presented the prize. "Very fleet. I wouldn't mind using you and your lovely lady in my formation dance team when we do our final demonstration." Mrs. Smith-Cholmondeley gave a shudder. "I don't think Mr. Brown and I are open to engagements," she broke in hastily as she caught a momentary gleam in Paddington's eye. Paddington nodded in agreement. "I haven't brought any more marmalade sandwiches either, Mr. Church," he said. Yes." Mr. Church looked slightly taken aback. "Talking of marmalade sandwiches," he continued, recovering himself, "what are you going to do with all of this food?" Paddington contemplated the prize for a moment. It was a very large hamper, an enormous one, in fact, and it was difficult to picture the many good things there must be inside it. "I think," he announced, amid general applause, "I'd like to send my half to the Home for Retired Bears in Lima, if it can be got there in time for Christmas. I don't think they can always afford very much extra." "It'll be done," said Mr. Church, "even if I have to fly it myself and divide it when I get there." "There's no need to divide it," said Mrs. Smith-Cholmondeley amid renewed applause. "They can have my half as well. After all, there's no time to be lost, and it sounds a very good cause. Especially," she added with a wry smile at her partner, "if the home's full of pears like Paddington. I wouldn't like to think of them going short of marmalade." "I wonder what Mrs. Smith-Cholmondeley meant by that last remark," said Mr. Brown as they drove home later that night, tired but happy. He glanced across the front seat. "Have you any idea, Paddington?" Paddington rubbed the steam from the window with his paw and peered out into the night. "I think it was to do with my chunks, Mr. Brown," he replied vaguely. Mrs. Brown gave a sigh. Life with a bear was full of unsolved mysteries. "I know one thing," she said. "There may be a lot of deserving cases in the home, and none more so than Aunt Lucy, I'm sure, but I very much doubt if they have any other bears quite like Paddington." "Impossible," said Mrs. Bird firmly. "Absolutely," said Judy. "With a capital I," said Jonathan. But Paddington was oblivious to the conversation going on about him. The first snowflakes of winter were already falling, and with the promise of more to come, not to mention the approach of Christmas himself, he was already looking forward to things in store. "I think," he announced to the world in general, "I shall keep my bicycle clips on in bed tonight. I want to keep myself warm in case I have any more adventures." The end. And that is our chapter of Paddington for the day. So, because I will not see you tomorrow, I hope that you enjoy a wonderful weekend. Go out and enjoy some of the sunny weather today, do something fun, and always take care of yourselves. I will see you bright and early Monday around noon with our next story. Bye!